In this video, we're going to continue building the Django and HTMX application for this finance app. So in the previous video, what we did was we generated some Django models for categories, and the important one here is the transaction model that tracks the user's transactions. So we have these models with all of the fields, and we've created the database with these migrations generated. And what we've also done is we've created a management script in Django, and that management script here will generate these fake transactions and allow us to generate some data to work with. So in this video, we're going to go a step further, and we're going to take this generated transaction data for users, and we're going to display them on a page in our Django application. So that's going to involve creating a Django view function and a URL, and it's also going to involve creating a template. Now we're also going to use DaisyUI and TailwindCSS for styling up the transactions that we're going to display, and then we're also going to build a FilterSet class using the Django filter package. And that filter set is going to allow us to filter the transactions based on some parameters coming in from a form. And the final thing we're going to do for the first time in this series is introduce HTMX, and we're going to submit that filter set form using HTMX. So there's a lot I want to cover here. Let's get started. What we're going to do to start with is have a look at the Github repository. Now, if you're following along with this is the structure that I have here. So we have the starter code in a folder, and then for every video that I want to do, I'm going to add a new folder to this repository. So we have the folder from the initial video here, it's called video 1, and that contains the final code from that video. I've cloned that locally, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy the video 1 folder, and you can do that in VS Code by just copying that. And then we're going to paste it in here, and I'm going to rename this folder to video 2. So if you want to follow along from where the series was in the previous video, that's the way to do that. Now what I'm going to do is just open the video 2 directory in VS Code, and we're going to work in this directory throughout the rest of this video. So I've now opened the terminal here and activated the virtual environment from the previous video, and let's get started with displaying transactions on the page. Now what I'm going to do is run the Django development server here. And once that's running, we can go to the Django admin UI. And remember, we created a super user in the previous video. So if you want to access the UI, you can do that. And what we have here is a bunch of different models within different applications. And notice that we have some from Django Oloth here for social accounts. We're not going to do anything with that at the moment. If you have any interest in that, drop a comment below the video. What we're going to look at is the transactions that we have in the database. Now, as you can see, this is the stringified version of these transactions, and it tells us whether the transaction was an income or an expense, and it tells us the amount for that transaction, along with the date and the user. Now, the point of me showing this is just to show you that we have now got 20 transactions in the database, and they're all tied to the user 𝗵𝗽𝗁. So we now want to create a view in the Django application that's going to show these on the page. So if we go back to the application here, we're logged in as 𝗵𝗽𝗁, but we need a way to see these transactions. So let's get back to VS Code, and we're going to start by creating a Django view, and that view is going to fetch the user's transactions and display them on the page. Now at the top here, I'm going to bring in a couple of imports. So just underneath the render function, I'm going to import the login required decorator from Django, and I'm also going to import the transaction model class. Now we have the index view that's serving a template called index.html. Let's go down below here, and we're going to create another one, and I'm going to call this transactions list. And as always in Django, it's going to take the request as a parameter, and we're going to fetch the transactions from the database. So I'm going to use the transaction model, and what do we need to do here? We need to call .objects.filter. Now importantly, if you have this kind of financial app, you don't want to be displaying transactions from other users. So we're going to filter by default here, and we're going to only get the transactions that are associated with the user that's logged in. Now that's going to be a request.user property. That's going to tell us who is sending the request, and that's either going to be an authenticated user, or it's going to be what's called an anonymous user in Django. But this transactions list page should not be available if you're not logged into the application. So let's copy the login required decorator, and we're going to decorate this view with login required. And that means that request.user is guaranteed to be a user that's registered and authenticated, and therefore to filter the transactions by that user is not going to cause any issues. We know the user is going to be in the database because they're guaranteed to be authenticated. So that's going to return the transactions. I'm going to create a context dictionary here, and we're going to create a key called transactions, and I'm going to copy that value. and we're going to reference those transactions query set that we pulled out of the database. And the final thing to do is return a template. So I'm going to copy the render function from the other view, and we're going to paste that in here. And what I want to return here is a template that we're going to create in a second called transactionslist.html, and we're going to add the context into that. And after we created the view, we're going to go to urls.py within this application, and I'm going to create a new URL here. So let's give it a path of transactions, and the view that we want to call is going to be views.transactionslist, and that's the one that we just created here. And we can also give that a name. So I'm going to give it a name of transactions-list. And if you pass a name to the path function like this, what it's going to do is it's going to allow you to reference that URL in the Django reverse function and also in the URL template tag in Django. So we now have the URL and the view here. What we're going to do is create this template called transactionslist.html. So what I'm going to do is go to the templates directory, and in the tracker application, we can create this particular template. So what this is going to do is it's going to extend the base.html. So that's tracker/base.html, and that came with the starter code for this series. And then we define a couple of blocks here. I'm going to define a head_title block, and I'll end that just below here. And what this is going to say, it's going to basically be the title of this page, and I'm going to give it the title of transactions list. If we look at base.html here, the head title is just going to allow you to generate a title for the page. If we go to the browser and we look at the title here, it's what appears in the tab at the top. So that's the title. The important block for actually showing the transactions is going to be defined in a content block, and we can end that block below. And within this block, we're going to write some code to display the transactions that we have in the context in this Django template in an HTML table. So to start with, let's go to index.html, and I'm going to copy this header1 tag. We're going to display a header on the transactions list page, and I'm going to paste that in here. And let's change the text content of this. Instead of the welcome message, this is going to be the transactions list page. So let's paste that in there. And what I also want to do here is I want to show an icon, and that should be an icon that somehow displays that this is a list page. So what I'm going to do, because we're using Tailwind, is go to this site here, and it's called Hero Icons. I'll leave a link to this in the description of the video. What we're going to do is search for an icon, and I'm going to put in list as the search term here, and we get back a set of icons that we can very easily add to our Django templates. Now I'm going to copy the SVG here and go back to VS Code, and in the H1 tag, I'm going to paste that in just before the transactions list text here. So we have an SVG, and that's the first child of the H1, and then we have the text, which is essentially the second child, and we're going to display these using flex classes. So for the H1, what I'm going to do is go to the right hand side here, and I'm going to use display of flex. And in Tailwind, to do that, you can add a flex class, and I'm going to use items center here, and also some margin bottom for this H1. So that's all we need to do. We've copied the H1 from the other template, and we've added the flex and the margin bottom classes, and we have this icon that we hope to appear on the page. So let's save this and go back to the page, and I'm going to go to the URL at /transactions. I'm going to see what that looks like. Now you can see the search icon here, the list icon, and we have the text here just right next to that. Now I'm going to add some margin to the end of this SVG. So let's go back here, and I'm going to go to the right hand side. Now the SVG itself has these two classes. We can add a margin end, and let's say of 2 here. If we go back to the page now and refresh, you can see we get a bit more space in between the icon and the text. Now below this, we want to actually build the table. Now what we're going to do here is go back to the DaisyUI documentation. And again, there's a link to this below the video, and I'm going to search for the table component. Let's search for that, and you can see some of the classes that we can use with DaisyUI. So the component class is table, and then we have some modifiers such as table zebra, and also different sizes that we can apply, such as table small, medium, and large. So let's go back to VS Code, and what we're going to do just below this header1 tag is we're going to create some more HTML here. So I'm going to check, first of all, do we have transactions in the context? So we're going to use a template if statement in Django, and don't forget to end that just below here. That's going to check if we have transactions being added. So this context here is trying to find transactions for the logged in user, but of course the user might not have uploaded anything. Now after we've done that check, we can go back to the template, and we're going to define here a table element, and I'm going to give this a class of table, and that's the component class from DaisyUI. Now just to speed things up a bit, I'm going to paste in the table headers here. So we have the table head element, And we're giving that some classes from Tailwind, so text extra small and also text white, that's going to make the text appear white, as well as uppercase for the table headers. And for each transaction we have a table header element that contains these headers for the date, the category, the type and the amount for the transaction. And each one of these table headers has been given some padding here, as you can see. So that's the table header. We can then create the table body, and that's going to contain the actual data that's coming back in the context for each one of these transactions. Now we need to loop over them, so let's create a template for loop, and we're going to say for transaction in transactions. And again, just below here, I'm going to end the for loop immediately so I don't forget. And then for each transaction, we'll create a row in the table, and that row is going to contain some table data elements. So TD elements for each one of the columns that we've defined above here. So let's start with the date. That's going to be transaction.date, and we can close the TD element here. Now this date field is a field on the Django model class for the transaction. So we have the transaction model, and you can see the date field that captures when the transaction occurred. We're referencing that here for each transaction that we're looping over. Now I'm going to copy this table data element down 3 more times. And we're now going to change the field that's referenced here. So as well as the date, we have the category, and that's the second column. The third column was for the type, so let's reference that here. And the final column was the amount for that given transaction. So that's the table body, and that's all we need to do for the table itself. But what I also want to do is, as well as checking if we have transactions, I want to add an else clause here. So just below the table, let's add the else clause. And if we don't have transactions, I want to send some text to the user. So I'm going to paste some text into this. So we have a paragraph tag with a couple of classes from Tailwind, and we're just telling the user that no transactions were found. So let me clean this up a bit. I'm going to tab the table itself over. And the final thing I want to do is surround the if statement with a div element. That's going to add some classes here. And I'm going to paste these classes in. So we have relative overflow x auto, and also the text white class. So all of the text within the table should be white. So let's tab everything else over one more time, and we can close the div just below the if statement here. And we're going to test this out now. So let's go back to the browser. And if we refresh this page, we now see that we have a table of transactions appearing on the page. So for the logged in user, we can now display all of their transactions in this table. What we're now going to do is add some links to this page from both the home page and also on the nav bar that you can see here at the top. So let's start with the home page. I'm going to go back to VS Code, and we can go to index.html, and let's have a look at the home page again, just in the application. Now we have some dummy text here. Of course, in a real application, you can fill that out with whatever you want for your app. I just want to have a link below this welcome message here that's going to allow the user to view their transactions. So let's go to index.html, and we're going to find that welcome message, and you can see it here. So I want to add this just below the div that we have and just below these paragraph tags. Let's add a div here, and I'm going to give this a class of border and also a class of margin bottom 6. And we'll close that div out, so it's only going to be a div that's going to have a border. And then just below that, we can create another div, and again, some margin bottom to that. Now within this div, we're going to create the anchor tag, and we're going to pass an href property that's going to use Django's URL template tag here. And the URL that we want to use is the transactions list URL. So let's copy this and go back to this template here, and it was index.html. We're going to reference that transactions list, and then when the user clicks the anchor tag, they're going to be taken to that page. And we're going to add some classes from Tailwind to this. So first of all, let's add font medium, and we're also going to make the text white, as we're going to do throughout the whole application for this anchor tag. And I also want to add a hover underline class to this. So basically when the user hovers over the link, we want the underline to appear, and that way the user knows that this is a link to another page. And finally, I'm going to add an icon into this anchor tag. So we're going to add those flex classes as well. So I'm going to move this onto a new line, and let's add flex and also items-center. And let's close off the anchor tag, and we need to give it some text as well. So let's give it some text now. It should say view my transactions. And the final thing I want to do is just add an icon before the text. So let's go back to hero icons. And for the view transactions icon, we're just going to search for chart here. And let's just copy the SVG for the very first of these elements and paste that in here. And the final thing to do is find the classes attached to that SVG. And again, let's add some margin end of 2. We can go back to the page now, and that's here in the application. And we should now see that we have a link to view the transactions. And if we click that, we are now taken to this page. Now we also need to add a link to the navbar at the top. Now if we look at the starter code, we can see we have a partials directory here that contains a navbar.html. And later on, as we use HTMX, we're going to extend this a lot, and we're going to include a lot of different partials. So let's now add the link to the navbar. And we're only going to add that link if the user is authenticated, and we're going to do it just before the logout link. Now in order to do this, let's just copy the text for the logout, and we're going to paste that in here and tab it over. And we can change the text here to my transactions, and also we need to change the URL that's being referenced in this anchor tag. So let's remove account logout, and we're going to replace that with the transactions list URL. So if we save that and go back to the page here, you can see at the top on the navbar that has now appeared, and we can also click that from the home page to be taken to the transactions page. So this seems to be working quite well at the moment. We have the ability to view the transactions, but notice something about the table that we have here. If we look at the date for these transactions, they are in no particular order. What we want to do here is we want to have the most recent transactions appearing first in the table, and we want to have that ordered from the most recent transactions at the top and most distant transactions at the bottom of the table. So how do we do that? There's different ways we could do it. So let's go back to VS Code. One way would be to use an order by clause in this query set. So after filtering, we could chain .order by onto this, and we could order by that date field in descending order. And that's a perfectly fine way to do that. If we save this and go back to the page, we're going to see that this is now ordered with the most recent transactions at the top, and that goes down to the bottom with the transaction that was most furthest away in the past. Now I think it's going to be common to order transactions by descending order of date. So what I'm going to do is remove this and go back to models.py. And this is an alternative way to create an ordering for a particular model or for the query set associated with that model. What we can do, and I'm going to do this just under the string method, is we can create a meta class, and we can set a property on that meta class called ordering. And I'm going to set that to a list that contains the single item, and we're going to use the date in descending order. So let's save models.py, and if we go to views.py, notice we no longer have the order by here. If we go back to the page and scroll to the top, when we refresh this page, we should see that the ordering is now still maintained, but this time it's being defined in the transaction models meta class using that ordering property. So that's good progress so far. We have a page here. Now what do we want to do next on this page? We want to allow users to do some filtering. So we want to, for example, switch between income and expenses. A user might only be interested in viewing the income fields or the expense rows in the database. And something else we might want to do is filter by category. So for example, if we wanted to see how much we'd spent on housing or food, we should be able to filter the list down to only those that have those categories. And as well as the categories, we might also want to see, well, how much did we spend on food between these two dates? So the ability to filter between two dates is also going to be important on this page. And the final thing we're going to do is also get some summary statistics. For example, what was the total income and the total expenditure from this data, and what was the net income from that data? So let's say you made $20,000 income, but your expenditure was $40,000 in total. Your net income there is going to be minus $20,000. So we're going to have some data displaying that just above this table later in the series. Now the important thing is we're going to attempt to do all of this just using HTMX. So no page reloads here when we do this kind of filtering. We want to update the table and all of the summary statistics based on those filters dynamically without a page reload using HTMX. So let's start simple. We're going to start by switching between income and expenditure. What I'm going to do is we're going to use a Django filter FilterSet now, and that's going to allow us to dynamically filter down the transactions based on potentially multiple parameters coming through in a GET request. So what I'm going to do is go to the Django filter documentation, and it's here, and there'll be a link to this below the video. And what this does specifically is it allows users to filter down a query set based on a model's fields, and it displays a form that allows them to do this. Now we did a video on Django filter that should be appearing on the screen now, so if you want to know more about this package, check that video out. Let's start by going to the installation section, and we can install Django filter using pip. So let's go back to VS Code, and I'm going to stop the Django server and paste that command into the virtual environment. And once you've installed that, you can go to your settings.py file and go to installed apps, and we're going to add Django filter to the installed apps. So let's go to the documentation and we're going to copy this line here, and we can go back to VS Code and add that to installed apps. And then what we can do is we can go to the tracker application here, and we're going to add a new file, and we're going to call that filters.py. Now we're going to build this from scratch to see how to use Django filters. Let's start by importing Django filters at the top, and we're also going to import the transaction model class that we're going to be using to filter that transaction query set down based on the parameters. Once we've got that, we can add a filter class. I'm going to call it transaction filter, and that's going to inherit from the Django filters.FilterSet class. Now if we look at models.py, if we want to be able to filter based on income or expenditure, it's the type field that we want to filter on. So let's add a meta class here, and that's going to link the filter set to the model transaction. And then the same way we do with Django form classes and REST framework serializers, we can add fields that we want to apply to the filter set class. And we do that with the meta.fields property. And I'm going to set that to transaction type. And because that's the only field in this tuple, we can add a comma at the end here. Now transaction type is not actually a field on the model. The field name is type, so why am I adding transaction type? That's because I'm going to override this. So let's go to the actual fields on this filter set, and we're going to define a field called transaction type. And that's going to be equal to a Django filters.choice filter. So Django filter has these different types of filters based on what the data type is or what kind of filtering you want to do. And what we're going to pass here is some choices, and that's going to be the transaction models transaction type choices field. If we go to models.py, that's this one here that defines the tuple containing two elements, one for income and one for expenses. And because we've given this a different name than the model field, what we can do is add another keyword argument here called field name. And this will reference the actual name of the field on the model, and the name of that field was type. And we can pass what's called a lookup expression here, and we can do that with this keyword argument. And for this, because we've defined the choices explicitly, we're going to use the iExact lookup. So that's a case insensitive exact lookup. And the final thing I want to add is an empty label for these choices, and we're going to say any. So this is our filter set class. We can use this filter set in the Django views.py file. So rather than calling this query set here, we're going to replace that by using the Django filter set class. So let's start by importing that at the top. From the filters module, we can import the transaction filter. And then let's scroll down to our view function here, and I'm going to replace these lines of code. So let's rename this to transaction_filter, and we're going to instantiate the transaction filter here, and we pass the data from the GET request into that. So let's imagine the user is going to submit a form on the front end that's going to send a GET request with the data that they want to use to filter. This is how we pass that form data from that GET request into the filter set, and then it will perform its magic and filter down the transactions based on those parameters. Now we need to also provide a base query set, and what we're going to do is define what we had before, so basically filtering down the transactions to only those attached to the logged in user. And we're also going to change what's in the context here. So I'm going to rename the context variable filter. And what we're going to pass in is the transaction filter set class itself. And by passing the transaction filter into the context, we're going to get access to a couple of useful properties on the filter set. Firstly, the query set after it's been filtered down based on those parameters. And secondly, we also get access to a form, and that's going to be a Django form under the hood. And the form itself is going to use the fields that we pass into the meta class, and it's going to render those out in a form on the front end. So let's now see how to apply that. Let's go back to transactions list.html, and I'm going to minimize the terminal here, and we're going to scroll up just above where we defined these transactions. And just above here, I'm going to add for now a form, and we're going to set the method to a GET request. Later on, very soon, we're going to move this over to use HTMX. But for now, let's just define a form explicitly with the GET method. Now within the form, let's define a div tag, and it's going to have a class of margin bottom 2, and we're going to use a form control class, and that's a component class from Tailwind. And when I say Tailwind, I actually mean DaisyUI here. So let's go to the DaisyUI documentation. Now I have a page open here on a select component, and that's what we're going to use because the choice field that we've got in the form, that allows us to select between an income and an expense. We want to show that as a select box. And we can use DaisyUI for this. We have the form control component class, And then we have a couple of extra component classes here, such as select and label. And as before with the table, we also have some modifiers, such as select bordered, select ghost, and so on. So we're going to render the form that's attached to that Django filter FilterSet, and we're going to give the label that class of label. And for the field itself, we want to render that out with the select class. Now, if we go back to VS Code, let's go to requirements.txt, and you can see that we have installed the Django widget tweaks package. Now, if you're not familiar with that, I've used it a lot in previous videos with HTMX and Django. This allows you to add classes directly to form fields in the Django templates. So let's go back to transactions list. At the top here, we're going to load the widget tweaks template tags. We can do that with the load widget tweaks directive. And if you're doing this, make sure that settings.py has widget tweaks in installed apps. If you're following from the starter code, it should already have that. Let's go back to transactions list. And if we go down to this form that we're defining here, we can now render out the form that's attached to the filter set. Now in views.py, we set the context variable to filter. So we're going to reference that here. And the filter set has a form property, and that contains a Django form instance that's attached to the filter set. And as I said, the form will contain fields based on what we define in the meta class. So it's the transaction type field. Let's copy that and go back to the template, and we're going to reference that here, and we can use a template filter from Django widget tweaks, and that's the add label class template filter, and we're going to add the label and also a text white class. And remember, this label class will come from DaisyUI. Once we've done that, we're going to go below here and we're going to use the render field template tag from Django widget tweaks, and again we're going to reference filter.form.transaction-type. And what we're going to add to that is some classes. So let's add the class, and let's give it a DaisyUI select component class. And I'm going to add background grey 50 here, as well as text grey -900. Now feel free to add whatever colours you want here for the background and for the text within this selection. Now once we've added that field, I'm going to paste in a button here that's going to allow us to submit the form. And that button has the button and button success classes. Now if we go back to DaisyUI again, I'm going to search for the button component here, and we can see the classes here. So that BTN, that's the component class for defining a button with DaisyUI. And button success is just going to add a modifier here, and that has the success color. Very similar to Bootstrap, but this is using DaisyUI. Now what I want to do at the moment is go back to VS Code and save this. And we're going to go back to the page here, and we're going to see that, well, it's not working exactly as we want. And one thing we need to do here is restart the Django development server. Once that's restarted, we can go back here and refresh. We can see the form, but we can't see any transactions. So let's go back to VS Code, and what we're looking for here are transactions. But we've removed the transactions from the context. We now just have a filter, and that filter has performed that filtering of the transaction query set, and we can get access to that query set directly using filter.qs. So this is checking if we have any objects in that query set, and then when we're looping over them, we also need to reference filter.qs just below here. If we save that now and go back to the page, we should now see that we have the transactions appearing in the table. Now if you watched the first video, you would have seen that the form is on the right hand side of the page and the table is on the left hand side. So we're going to take this form and move it to the right hand side, and the table should appear on the left. And we can use the Tailwind grid column system in order to do this. So I'm going to go to the documentation on grid template columns, and you can see these classes here such as grid columns 1. We also have grid column 2, 3, 4 and so on. And these are utilities for specifying the number of columns in a grid layout. Now I'm going to go back to the page here, and let's imagine that we want the table to take up 3/4 of the page. So I'm going to define 4 columns, and the table here is going to be on 3 out of 4 of those columns, and the form that we have at the top is going to be on the final 1 out of 4 columns. So let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to define that column layout now. We're going to do this within this div that we've given these classes. So let's go down here and define another div here with a class of grid. And as well as grid, we're going to give it the grid calls 4 class. And that's telling Tailwind that we want this to be on 4 columns. And we can also specify a gap between each column. I'm going to set that to gap 4. Now let's end this just below here. And I'm going to add a couple of comments just below. So we want 3 out of 4 columns for the table of transactions. And then just below that, we want 1 out of 4 columns for the form. And I'm also going to add a comment just above this div here that defines the grid. This is the container div for that grid. Let's start with the table. We want to move the table into this section of the code. So underneath the form where we have the if statement, let's copy all of the code down to the bottom of this if statement. And I'm going to cut that out of here and paste that just into this element here. And what we can do if we go to the top here is just before we look at the if statement, we can define another div here, and that's going to have a class of column span 3. And that's what's going to tell Tailwind that we want this to take up 3 out of 4 columns. And then again, we're going to tab everything over. Once we've done that, we can close off that div. And then after we've defined the div with the column span of 3, I'm going to copy that and go back down here. And just underneath this comment, let's define the second grid, or second column rather, and that's going to have a column span of 1. And we can close that div as well just below. And finally, let's move the form that we have into this new column, and we can paste that here. So let's now test this out. If we go back to the page and we look at this page now, if we refresh, you can see now that the table is on the left-hand side, and we have on the right the filter form that allows us to filter by income or expense. Now, does this work at the moment? If we select income here and we click filter, you can see that we get back the table that contains only the filtered rows with the type of income. And that will work if we select expense as well. We get back only the rows where we have expenses. Now at the moment this is not using HTMX, so each time we send a request here using the filter button, it's going to send a normal HTTP request and we get back the response, and that reloads the entire page. So we're going to move this to HTMX, and actually we're going to do that in the next video. I think this one's running quite long and I actually have somewhere to go round about now anyway, so I'm going to have to stop. But there is one final thing I want to do here. If we look at this in the developer tools and we go to the mobile view, we can see that this is not responsive. So the form at the right hand side here is appearing on top of the table. So what we're going to do is change some of the classes that we have on the grid system. So let's go back to VS Code here, and we're going to find the class that defines our grid. That's this one here. And we're only going to display this in a grid if we have a medium-sized screen or above. So let's add the MD modifier here. So the grid and the grid calls 4 classes as well as gap4. We're going to only display those when the screen is of medium size. And what we can do at the start is default to the flex classes. And we're going to use flex call so that that stacks up from top to bottom. And I'm also going to use reverse here. And what flex call reverse is going to do is it's going to change the order here. So rather than the table, we're going to see the form appearing at the top of the page. And the final thing I want to do to this div is also add a class, add an ID here. And that ID is going to be called transaction-container. And this ID is going to be important when we bring HTMX in. We're going to use that as a target very soon in this project. Let's go back to the browser and we're going to refresh the page. You can see that it still looks roughly the same when we are on the normal view. But if we go to the developer tools and we look at the mobile view now, you can see that the form is appearing above the table. So that's stacked up on top, and that's going to be more usable. It's a better user experience if we have this application and our users are using this page. So that's all for this video. We have displayed the transactions in a template, and we've used a Django filter FilterSet in order to filter down what's displayed on the page. And we've also created a responsive view for this page. In the next video, we're going to add HTMX so that when we submit this form, it's going to do the filtering dynamically using an AJAX request that HTMX is going to control. So we're going to set that up in the next video. And we're also going to optimize some of these queries using Django Debug Toolbar. So stay tuned for that in the next video. Thanks for watching. Give it a thumbs up if you've enjoyed the video, and subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so. And if you're enjoying this content, consider buying the channel a coffee. We have a link in the description, and we'll see you in the next video.